The email arrived just after midnight when the city outside Ava Monroe's window had quieted to a hush, and the only light in her studio apartment came from the glow of her laptop and the votive candle she always lit for her mother. The subject line was disarmingly plain private care position, immediate start, high compensation, full discretion required. Ava almost deleted it. Midnight offers rarely meant anything good, but debt had a way of softening suspicion, and grief still fresh, still raw, had taught her that sometimes the doors that opened in the dark were the only ones that opened at all. She clicked. The message was concise but elegant, written in the kind of measured tone that suggested old money and older habits. A patient male 30 recently recovering required companionship and professional oversight at a private estate in Napa Valley. A temporary assignment. 1 week to assess suitability for a longer engagement. 5 figures on completion. A confidentiality agreement attached like a shadow. Ava leaned back, the chair creaking beneath her. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, then drifted to the photograph taped to the lamp beside her desk. Her mother smiling despite the IV taped to the inside of her elbow, saying, "If you can heal, heal. If you can't, be the reason someone else wants to." Ava was a hospice nurse because of that smile, because of that sentence, because she knew how to stay with people in their endings without flinching. But lately, the work had been taking more than it gave. She was exhausted balancing 2 shifts in the relentless climb of the bills her mother left behind. Napa Valley, an estate, a man recovering. It sounded off, like a fairy tale that had misplaced its moral. She replied anyway. By 9 a.m., her phone rang. The voice on the other end was velvet over steel. "Ms. Monroe." "This is Meredith Sterling. My husband and I run Sterling Vineyards. We were given your name as someone particularly gifted with difficult cases." A pause like a breath caught on a thorn. "Our son Elijah needs help." Not physical help, Ava sensed. The kind you don't say aloud because saying it would make it too large to control. "When did the accident happen?" Ava asked, testing the weight of their story. "Some wounds don't appear on scans," Meredith said. "We can discuss details in person." That was when Ava should have said no, when the unspoken thickened into a veil. But then Meredith named the number. The kind of number that would clear a credit card, pay off the last of the funeral, give Ava room to pursue the dream she'd carefully folded and put away medical school someday, if life ever stopped costing so much. "I'll come for the week," Ava said softly. "After that, we'll see." "Pack for rain," Meredith replied. "The valley is temperamental this season." The car met her at dawn 2 days later, gliding her out of the city and into a world washed with green and gold. Vine rows marched in perfect discipline across the hills, mist caught in the vines like held breath. The Sterling estate revealed itself, slowly iron gates, a long drive lined with cypress. A house of stone and glass perched like a watchful animal above the valley. A storm simmered on the horizon, a bruise deepening over the ridge. As Ava stepped from the car, the air tasted electric ozone and harvest and something old. The front door opened before she reached it, and an elderly man with eyes full of quiet loyalty bowed slightly. "Ms. Monroe," he greeted, "I'm Alfred. Welcome to Sterling House." Inside, the world was curated to perfection: oil paintings, a grand piano, shelves of first editions, orchids in glass. It was beautiful, yes, but curated beauty can be as cold as polished marble. No laughter lived in these walls. No photographs of messy joy. "Meredith is waiting for you in her study," Alfred said gently, as if apologizing for the formality of it all. "And Ms. Monroe." "Yes, he is a good man." Ava met his gaze. "Is he the one I'm here for?" Alfred's smile was small but sincere, in more ways than one. Meredith Sterling rose as Ava entered, impeccable silk blouse, silver hair swept back a face both warm and wary. Beside her, Charles Sterling stood like a retired general who had never wholly retired. Their eyes held hunger, but not the devouring kind. The kind of hunger parents keep when love has failed to fix what frightens them. "Thank you for coming," Meredith said. "We know your time is valuable." "I'm here to do what I can," Ava replied. "What exactly does he need?" A flicker of something passed between the Sterlings. Charles spoke first. Our son is intelligent, exceptionally so, but he has difficulties with people, with contact, with the world outside these gates. So not an accident, Ava said quietly. Not one, the body shows Meredith answered. He lives mostly upstairs, in the library and the observatory. He loves the night. It's the daytime he can't hold. Ava felt the familiar stir of protective instinct, the one that rose for every patient who had learned to fear the ordinary. How honest are you planning to be with him about me being here? We'll say you're here for wellness oversight, Meredith said too quickly. Stress management. He won't accept help if he feels targeted, so you want me to play a part. We want you to save our son Charles, said blunt and breaking. We'll do whatever it takes. A thunderclap rolled over the roof, a long, low warning. Ava nodded. I'd like to meet him. Alfred guided her through a corridor of glass and shadow, up a flight of stairs that spiraled toward a tower room crowned in windows. The library was cathedral-high, paper-scented, golden with lamplight against the gray day. And there at the edge of a great arched window, hunched over a telescope like a pilgrim at an altar, was Elijah Sterling. He turned at the soft scrape of her shoe on the rug. For a heartbeat, he went absolutely still. Breath hitched. Hands trembled where they gripped the railing. Not fear of her, Ava realized, but fear of what she represented: intrusion, exposure, change. I'm Ava, she said, staying by the door, voice low and warm. Your mother asked me to check on you, but if you'd rather I leave, I can. No one's going to make you do anything you don't want to. He blinked, surprised. Men like him weren't usually offered permission to say no. They were protected, persuaded, pushed. Jupiter's visible, he murmured, as if offering a password. Even through cloud cover, if you know where to look. She smiled. I never know where to look. You could show me from there. I'll stay here. His shoulders loosened, just a fraction. The storm cracked open above them, rain racing down the windows like a curtain. In the dim, Eli's eyes were green like river glass, wary but curious. He adjusted the telescope, hand still shaking, voice a little steadier. You can come closer, he said, not looking at her. Just slowly. She did. Not to the telescope, but to the chair beside the door, close enough to listen, far enough to be safe. Tell me why you love the sky, she asked. He told her. Not fluently, he tripped over words, circled back, stopped to swallow, but with a kind of fragile brilliance that made Ava forget to breathe. By the time Alfred brought tea, Eli had moved 2 steps toward her, and Ava had learned 3 constellations by heart. Outside, thunder rolled again, impatient. Inside, something less dramatic but far more dangerous began. A man who had learned to fear a hand in the air paused long enough to consider reaching for it. If this moment touched something quiet in you, if you've ever watched someone learn to breathe inside their own life, stay. Like leave a thought, follow along. Stories like this one grow stronger when we hold them together. The candle on Ava's desk was miles away now, but in the library's soft gold, she felt her mother's sentence bloom again. If you can heal, heal. If you can't, be the reason someone else wants to. Perhaps, she thought, as Elijah Sterling finally met her eyes, she was here to do both. The rain didn't stop that night. It came in waves, sometimes soft as breath against the windows, sometimes thrashing like the ocean trying to reclaim the land. But inside the library tower, the storm was distant, a murmuring backdrop to something quieter, more fragile. Ava didn't sleep. The guest room Meredith assigned her was beautiful vaulted ceilings, lavender-scented linens, a window that framed the vineyard like a painting. But Ava lay atop the covers in her sweatshirt and socks, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening. Not to the rain, but to the echo of Elijah's voice as he whispered facts about Jupiter, the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted the telescope, the way he kept looking toward her, without quite letting himself look at her. It had taken her years to learn how to read fear that spoke in silence. Elijah was fluent in it. When dawn arrived, gray and reluctant, Ava rose before the house stirred. She dressed in a simple navy sweater and jeans, tying her curls back with a silk scarf her mother once wore to Sunday church. Something about the scarf, its faded beauty, its quiet dignity, felt like armor. She found the kitchen by scent fresh-bread coffee time. Alfred stood at the stove humming a song that belonged to a time long before email offers and glass-walled towers. "Good morning, Ms. Monroe," he said, eyes warm. "You're up early." "Old habit," she said, pouring coffee. "In hospice, the best moments come before the world remembers to be busy." Alfred nodded. "You slept well." "I stayed still," she said honestly. "That's a kind of rest." He studied her gently, as though weighing whether she could carry the weight ahead. "Then he's always in the library this early, or the observatory. He'll come down for breakfast if the wind is low." She glanced toward the window. "It's still gusty. Then he'll likely wait." Ava took her coffee and walked the corridor back to the library. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't invite sound. Her footsteps softened on the Persian rug, and when she reached the arched entry to the tower, she paused. Elijah was there. He sat cross-legged on the floor beneath a sprawling mobile of the solar system sketchpad on his lap pencil, dancing across the page in quick, uncertain strokes. He wore a gray hoodie and soft cotton pants barefoot, the kind of undone that didn't come from laziness, but from forgetting that other people might see you. His head lifted when he sensed her presence, but his eyes stayed low, fixed somewhere in the space between her hands and her coffee mug. "You came back," he said, voice a rough hush. "I said I would," she replied, leaning against the doorframe. "And besides, I don't know how to find Jupiter without your help." Something flickered across his face, a smile almost, but it passed too quickly to catch. "I'm drawing Titan," he murmured. "It's Saturn's largest moon. It rains methane there." "Sounds like a place built for storms," she said, stepping forward slowly. He blinked. "That's kind of beautiful." "I think most broken things are," she said quietly, moving to a nearby armchair. "You just have to meet them where they are." He didn't reply, but his pencil paused. Ava let the silence grow. Not the uncomfortable kind she'd learned over years with the dying and grieving, that stillness could be more intimate than words. She watched as he shaded the curve of Titan's surface, meticulous and methodical, like the act of creation was the only way he knew to stay present. "You always draw?" she asked after a while. He nodded once. "It's safer. People shift. Pages don't." Ava considered that. "Did someone shift on you?" He looked up, and for the first time his gaze held hers. His eyes were a color she couldn't name. Not quite green, not quite gray. Something caught between moss and smoke. She saw everything in them, the brilliance, the bruises, the hunger for something he didn't know how to ask for. "Yes," he said, "everyone." She set her coffee down, the clink against the side table soft, but deliberate. "I won't promise to be perfect, but I can promise I don't lie. And I don't leave without saying goodbye." That made him flinch, not from suspicion, but from unfamiliarity. People didn't usually declare rules of engagement like that. He returned to his sketching. "Do you know anything about Europa? I know it's cold." He almost smiled again. "It's believed to have a saltwater ocean beneath its ice, possibly warm enough to sustain life." Ava tilted her head. "So underneath everything that looks dead, something might still be alive." He nodded. "You're quick, just observant." "I'm not used to that." "I am," she said softly. They sat for a long time in that space, Elijah drawing moons and metaphors, Ava sipping cooling coffee, each learning the rhythm of the other's breath. Outside, the rain eased into drizzle. Inside, the hush between them settled not into awkwardness, but into understanding. At some point, Elijah walked to a shelf and pulled down a leather-bound volume. He held it out, still not meeting her eyes. "This is my favorite book," he said, "about celestial migration. It's dense, but beautiful." She took it, fingers brushing his for half a second. He didn't recoil, but he didn't linger either. "Thank you," she said. "I'll read it tonight." He hesitated. "If you want, I can explain some of the hard parts." "I'd like that." Something small and almost invisible shifted in the room. A door not opened, but unlocked. That evening they met again. Not by design, but by gravity. Ava returned to the tower at sunset with the book in hand. Elijah was already there, setting up the telescope. The sky had cleared. They didn't speak much. He pointed out Andromeda Vega Polaris. She asked him questions she didn't need to ask, just to hear the way he wrapped language around knowledge like a gift he wasn't sure she'd want. And when their hands brushed again, reaching for the same page in a star chart, he didn't flinch. Instead, he whispered, "You smell like lavender." She smiled. "It's my mother's scarf." She said it made her feel brave. He looked at her then full on and said, barely louder than breath, "It suits you." The moon rose quietly that night, casting silver across the observatory's glass dome. And in the glow, two strangers who had once lived only in the silence of their own minds stood side by side, not quite touching, not quite speaking, but seeing. Sometimes the first contact isn't skin to skin, but soul to soul. And when it happens, it doesn't announce itself. It just is steady as orbit, soft as moonlight, and irreversible as a falling star. The rain returned the next morning, more a mist than a storm, fine, persistent, and soft as sighs against the tall windows of the Sterling estate. Ava stood at the threshold of the main hall, coffee in hand, watching it slide in rivulets down the glass, like memories that refused to evaporate. The house in daylight revealed more than its shadowed elegance. It wasn't just old, it was untouched. Immaculate, yes. Impressive, certainly. But beneath the polished wood and curated light, Ava felt something she could not quite name. Absence. It clung to the drapes, lingered in the corners, hung between the furniture like forgotten breath. As if something had once lived here, joy, laughter, youth, and then quietly slipped out the back door, never to return. She wandered not aimlessly, but gently tracing the architecture with her eyes like one might read a diary without permission. The dining room, long enough for a banquet but clearly untouched in years, had a single setting laid at one end, a white plate, a silver fork, a linen napkin, pressed to military perfection. Ava imagined Elijah perhaps years ago sitting there with his parents, the conversation brittle, the silences heavy, the kind of meals where food was served but nothing was ever truly shared. She moved on. The parlor held a grand piano, black glossy closed. No photos on its surface. No sheet music waiting to be played. Just a rose in a crystal vase. Real, not silk. Fresh. A single bloom. It felt less like decoration and more like mourning. At the end of the corridor, a door stood ajar. The room behind it was a study, dimly lit, lined with books and masculine in its simplicity. Leather chairs, a map of the constellations mounted like artwork, and on the wall behind the desk, finally something personal. A photograph. 3 people. Elijah, perhaps 14, eyes large and solemn behind wireframe glasses. Meredith beside him, posture composed, a hint of a smile, her hand hovering near his shoulder, but not quite touching. Charles behind them, both hand firm on Elijah's other shoulder, his expression unreadable. It was the only photograph in the house Ava had seen. She stepped closer. Elijah's eyes in the photo were not afraid, not exactly, but uncertain. A boy dressed in expectations, not comfort. A child taught to pose before he knew how to play. She turned from the photo and caught her reflection in the glass of the bookshelf. For a moment she imagined how she must appear in this space, a woman with eyes, 2 knowing shoulders, too used to wait standing where she didn't belong. And yet somehow necessary. Exploring Meredith's voice broke the quiet. Ava turned to see her in the doorway, a porcelain teacup in hand, her silk robe the color of moonlight. Trying to understand the story this house is trying not to tell, Ava replied softly. Meredith arched a brow. You believe houses have stories. Always, especially the quiet ones. Meredith stepped in, graceful as a cat. This house was never meant to be quiet, but Elijah, he changed it. Or perhaps it changed to accommodate him. She sat in the chair behind the desk, the one Ava suspected had belonged to Charles before he retired to the vineyard. There was strength in Meredith's stillness, but also fatigue. When Elijah was born, she began, as if pulled into confession by the rain, we weren't prepared for him. Not for who he would be. He wasn't like the other boys. He didn't cry when he was hungry. He didn't reach for toys. He preferred silent stars, the shapes light made on the walls. Ava said nothing, letting the quiet encourage more. We took him to specialists. Dozens. Some said he was gifted. Some said he was delayed. All said he was different. Meredith's gaze drifted to the photo. Charles tried to discipline the difference out of him. I tried to soothe it away. Neither worked. So you made the house quieter, Ava said gently. So he wouldn't have to be. Meredith's lips curled bittersweet. You're the first person who's understood that. I don't know if I do. Not fully. But I've walked through enough silent rooms to know what they're hiding. The older woman looked at her for a long moment. You see him, don't you? Ava didn't hesitate. Yes. Even after 2 days, a small smile touched Ava's mouth. Sometimes it only takes one. Meredith nodded slowly. He's drawn to you, more than he knows, but that's why you must be careful. With him, a kindness isn't just a kindness. It becomes an anchor. I don't offer anything I don't mean, Ava said, her voice like steady rain. And I don't take lightly what it means to be trusted. They sat in silence, then two women from opposite worlds, bound by their connection to a man who had never learned how to live comfortably inside his own skin. After a moment, Meredith said he had a friend once. When he was 10, a boy named Spencer. They met during a vineyard tour. For 3 days, they were inseparable. Spencer climbed trees, chased frogs. Elijah followed him like the moon follows tide. Ava's chest tightened. What happened? Spencer's mother found out about Elijah's sensitivities, said she didn't want her son catching something strange. They left. Elijah didn't leave his room for a month. After that, he stopped trying. Ava looked down at her hands. No wonder he flinched when I smiled. Meredith rose, adjusting her robe. I don't expect miracles, Ms. Monroe. But if you can give him even a day where he doesn't feel like a mistake, that's more than anyone's done in 20 years. She left without waiting for a reply. Ava stood there for a while, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall, to the hush of rain and memory and regret. Then she walked slowly back toward the tower. Elijah was curled up on the couch in the library legs, tucked beneath him, sketch pad once again in hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable, but not unwelcoming. Your mother tells beautiful stories, Ava said. He shrugged. She tells them to herself more than anyone else. Ava sat across from him. She told me about Spencer. A flicker of something, fear maybe, or embarrassment crossed his face. She didn't have the right, he said, quiet but firm. She didn't betray you, Ava said gently. She honored you. Elijah's pencil stopped moving. She told me you tried, Ava said, that you let someone in once. That matters. He stared at the page, then flipped it closed. I hate this house. Ava tilted her head. Why? Because it never lets go of things. It's full of echoes, of expectations, of rooms that were never mine even when they had my name on the door. Ava looked around. Then maybe it's time to give it something new to remember. Elijah turned his face toward the rain-streaked glass. Like what? Like the sound of your own voice, she said, unashamed. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, do you know what I used to whisper to the walls when I couldn't sleep? She shook her head. I used to say, I'm still here, don't forget me. His voice cracked, as if a house could remember what people don't. Ava's throat tightened. You're still here, Elijah, she whispered, and I see you. He didn't look at her, but his hand inched forward, resting on the table between them. She didn't reach for it, not yet, but she placed her own hand near enough for him to feel its presence. And in a house full of ghosts, for the first time, someone chose to stay. There are touches that come like lightning, electric, impulsive, wild, with intention. And then there are those so soft, so tentative, so profoundly fragile that they barely feel like contact at all. Just a question, asked with skin. Elijah's touch was the second kind. It didn't happen in the library nor during one of their long dusk talks in the observatory. It wasn't coaxed or planned. It happened like all real moments do when no one was watching, not even the people living them. It had been 4 days since Ava arrived. 4 days of a rhythm forming quietly between them. She didn't press him, he didn't retreat. They circled each other the way the earth turns to face the sun, gradually, almost reluctantly, but drawn by something fundamental. That morning the storm had broken. For the first time in what felt like a long while, sunlight spilled into the house through every window, catching on the dust motes and the fine grain of the wooden floors. The vineyard outside glistened wet, and gold rows of vines arching toward a sky scrubbed clean. Elijah always walks the gardens after a storm, Alfred told Ava over breakfast, his voice warm with affection. Says the earth smells honest then. "Do I have permission to join him?" she asked, even though she hadn't seen Elijah that morning. Alfred smiled. "I think he's waiting for you." Ava found him standing beneath a pear tree near the northern slope of the estate, barefoot, in damp grass, face lifted to the sky, like a sunflower just relearning how to bloom. He didn't turn when she approached, but she saw his fingers twitch at his sides, subtle, involuntary, a nervous invitation. "It smells like the forest after rain," she said, standing beside him, keeping one respectful pace away. "Like something old waking up." He nodded. "The petrichor, that's the scent." "Petrichor," she repeated. "Even the name feels like poetry." He looked at her, then eyes soft with something close to gratitude. "You always repeat words like they're gifts. I was taught to listen twice before speaking once." Elijah let that settle between them. He was dressed simply, charcoal sweater linen pants rolled at the ankle sleeves, pushed to the elbow. His forearms were lean, pale, etched with constellations of faint scars and old sun. "I used to come here after hard days," he murmured, "when I was younger. And now, if knows, now I come after soft ones, trying to teach my body the difference." Ava smiled quietly, proud. "Is today soft?" He didn't answer, but he took a breath as if it might be. They walked slowly through the rows of young olive trees and tall lavender bushes humming with bees. A bird sang somewhere overhead. The breeze carried the scent of wet soil, citrus blossoms, and something older, something unnameable. They reached a bench at the edge of the rose garden. It was carved from pale stone, worn smooth by weather and time. Elijah sat first cautiously, as if the earth might object. Ava joined him, leaving space between their bodies, but letting her knees angle slightly toward his. "Do you believe in memory?" he asked, not as thought, but as feeling. "Like your skin remembers things your brain doesn't." Ava considered. "Yes. Sometimes it feels like my hands remember holding people who are gone, like an echo in the palms." Elijah's hands rested in his lap. He stared down at them. "Mine remember fear." And still she said gently, "You let me near." His gaze lifted. "I don't want to be afraid of kindness anymore." A butterfly danced across the path in front of them, white wings luminous in the light. She waited, let the moment breathe. Then carefully she turned her hand palm up on the bench between them. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. The invitation was silent. Seconds passed, one then another. He didn't move. Then barely there a brush. His fingers, cool and trembling, ghosted across her knuckles before retreating again. Ava didn't flinch. She simply waited. A few heartbeats later, he tried again. This time he let his fingers rest atop hers. It was not a full clasp, not an embrace, just skin against skin. A contact so light it could have been mistaken for coincidence. But to them it was everything. Ava turned her palm slightly, allowing his hand to rest more fully in hers. She said nothing, just held the quiet with him. The warmth between them built not from heat, but from permission. Permission to be, to touch without demand, to connect without fear, to exist here and now and be met with stillness rather than scrutiny. A breeze rustled through the roses. Somewhere a wind chime stirred. Elijah's thumb shifted slightly against her palm, tracing the curve of her lifeline. "I thought I'd never." He began, then stopped, swallowed. Ava squeezed his hand, the pressure gentle but certain. "You are," she said. He looked at her, eyes wide, with the aching honesty of someone rediscovering something lost, something he didn't believe he was allowed to want. And then, without warning, he leaned his head lightly against her shoulder. Not fully, not in surrender. Just to rest. Ava didn't move, didn't speak. She turned her face toward the horizon, the hills glimmering in morning gold, and let the moment unfold around them. They stayed that way for a long time. The first touch had come not as an accident, but as a choice. Not because of passion, but because of trust. And in that small space between skin and soul, something began to bloom slowly, cautiously, beautifully. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of its shape. Night had fallen with unusual tenderness. Above the Sterling estate, the stars returned, not just as distant pinpricks, but as a full velvet sprawl of constellations, luminous and patient. It was the first truly clear night since Ava arrived, and Elijah had asked her shyly, almost as if afraid of his own voice, if she'd join him in the observatory. He didn't say what for. He didn't need to. Ava climbed the spiral staircase that led to the glass dome room just past midnight, barefoot, a sweater pulled over her nightgown. The house had fallen asleep hours ago, but this part of it, this small tower above the world, was awake. Elijah stood by the telescope, his back to her, adjusting the scope with reverence. He didn't look up as she entered, but she felt him register her presence like a musician, sensing the audience before the first note. He had lit a few lamps, their golden glow barely touching the curved walls. In the faint light, Ava could see the careful notes laid out across the table, sketches of lunar faces, deep space coordinates, a page marked with the name Messier 57. She moved quietly to his side. "The Ring Nebula," she said, recognizing the name. Elijah turned to her, then surprised. "You know it." She smiled softly. "I read your book." He blinked, unsure whether to be pleased or embarrassed. "I didn't think you'd finish." "I didn't finish," he replied. "I devoured it." That pulled the smallest, most reluctant smile from him, but it didn't last. His eyes drifted toward the telescope again. "I wanted to show you something," he said. "Something I've only ever shared with the sky." He motioned toward the eyepiece, stepping aside. Ava leaned in, adjusted her breath before the lens. And there it was, a halo in space. The remnants of a star that had collapsed on itself, now glowing like a ring of light, mourning its own absence. It was haunting. Beautiful, infinite. "Elijah," she whispered, her breath catching. He was watching her, arms crossed over his chest, not guarded, but folded as if to keep himself from shaking. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that maybe people were like stars. That some of us burned so quietly no one noticed when we went out." Ava looked up from the scope. "But you didn't go out." He met her gaze for only a second before looking away. "Didn't I?" They stood in silence for a beat. The kind of silence that asked hard questions. Ava stepped toward him. "You burn in ways most people can't see," she said. "But I see it. I see you." He closed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice trembled. "Sometimes I look at the stars and wonder if any of them remember me." Ava reached for him, slow and sure, placing her hand gently on his forearm. "They don't forget their own," she said. He turned to her fully then. Something unspoken passed between them, bigger than either had prepared for. And in the stillness of the dome, the air shifted. The quiet deepened. "Do you ever cry?" he asked suddenly. The question came not like a challenge, but like a child knocking softly on a locked door. Ava nodded. "Often." "I don't," he said. "I can't. Not really. But sometimes, when I'm alone and I look through the telescope, my throat tightens. Like my body wants to weep but forgot how." She stepped closer, so close that the warmth of her reached him before her hands did. "Elijah," she said softly, "grief doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it shows up in how we hold our breath, or in the places we go to feel less alone." He looked at her, then really looked, and whatever he saw broke something open. He didn't cry in the way movies taught boys they should. He didn't sob, but his shoulders shook once. His lips parted, and his eyes shone. Two tears, silent and pure, slipped down his cheeks. Not out of weakness, but release. Ava reached up and touched his face, not to wipe the tears away, but to honor them. He closed his eyes under her touch. "I was 6, he whispered, "when I first looked through a telescope. My father had just yelled at me. I couldn't remember why. I ran outside and stared at the sky so long my neck ached. That night I dreamed I lived on one of the moons of Saturn, alone, but safe." And now, she asked, her voice a hush. He opened his eyes. "Now I dream of Earth, of staying." She let her hand fall slowly from his cheek. "Then let's keep looking up, together." The wind stirred outside, brushing against the glass like a soft knock from the heavens. He reached for her then, not a handshake, not a grasp, just a hand over hers, fingertips curved around fingers like a code only they could decipher. And for a long time they stood by the telescope, side by side, watching the stars, witnessed by the moon, held by the sky, and anchored by a touch more honest than words could ever be. It was not just the first time Elijah cried. It was the first time he cried with someone. And in that fragile, sacred moment, the boy who had always run to the stars finally found a reason to stay grounded. The vineyard turned golden in late afternoon, the sun sliding low behind the hills like a secret. Vines twisted in perfect rows, heavy with promise. and the air hung thick with the scent of ripening fruit and the faintest whisper of oak barrels resting deep in the cellar below. Ava stood at the edge of the garden with pruning shears in hand, her fingers gently brushing the stems of overgrown roses. Elijah had gone back to the observatory after lunch, needing solitude not out of retreat but ritual. Since that night of tears beneath the stars, he'd begun carving out small sanctuaries in the day places where his mind could reorganize the sensations of being seen. And Ava, she welcomed the silence. It gave her room to reflect, to wonder, to remember why she came here at all. She clipped a withered bloom from the stem, watching the petals fall. For a fleeting second, she envied them, their graceful detachment, the way they let go without hesitation. But not all things that fall do so with grace. A crunch of gravel behind her broke her thoughts. She turned to see Meredith approaching, hairpin flawlessly pearls at her neck, even in the garden heat. "I hope you don't mind me intruding," Meredith said, her smile polite and practiced. "I find pruning very meditative." Ava handed her the shears. "Be my guest." They stood in companionable quiet for a few minutes, the only sounds the clip of metal and the soft murmur of doves in the distance. "I've seen the way Elijah looks at you," Meredith said finally. Her tone was even, but the words settled heavy in the air. Ava didn't respond immediately. She removed her gloves, brushed soil from her palms. "I care for him," Ava said simply. "That hasn't changed." "And yet," Meredith said, eyes still on the flowers, "there are things you haven't told him." Ava turned. "Such as?" Meredith glanced at her, sharp and knowing. "Why you took this job. Why you, of all the applicants, were handpicked." Ava's breath caught. "I was told you needed someone who could reach him." "You were recruited," Meredith corrected, "by a firm that screens emotional intelligence, trauma, familiarity, and most importantly, discretion." "Do you really believe that was coincidence?" Ava felt the ground shift under her. "I never claimed to be anyone other than who I am. But you let him believe this was chance," Meredith said, voice quiet now. "That you just appeared one day to understand him. You let him think you chose him." "I did choose him," Ava said, her tone steady. "Even if the door was open for me, I walked through it on my own." Meredith nodded, but her eyes were cool. "And when he finds out the door was bought and paid for," Ava flinched. It was true. She had been approached, not just recommended, but selected. A private consultant had called her 2 weeks before her arrival. The voice on the line had praised her background, her skill with emotional trauma, her ability to read without pressing. And yes, they had offered generous compensation. But none of that had mattered the moment she met Elijah. Still, guilt had a way of growing, like ivy quiet, curling around the clean edges of truth, until everything beautiful looked overgrown with doubt. "I never lied to him," Ava said, more to herself than to Meredith. "You didn't have to," Meredith replied. "Omissions are just truths in shadow." With that, she handed the shears back and walked away, her figure poised against the sinking sun. That evening, Elijah found Ava in the kitchen, humming softly as she folded a cloth napkin into a swan. A silly habit from her grandmother's dinners, something she did when anxious. He watched her a moment before speaking. "I was thinking about Titan again," he said. She looked up, smiling gently. "Still dreaming of storms?" He nodded. "But I want to know how it feels to stand in one. With someone." Ava's heart ached. She reached for a mug, poured him tea the way he liked it. Honey first, then hot water, never stirred. "Elijah," she began, but faltered. He took the cup, cradled it. "You're leaving." The words struck like thunder, what she whispered. He didn't look at her. "I heard my mother on the phone. She said your contract ends in 2 weeks, that you were never meant to stay longer." Ava sat slowly. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "Elijah, did you know that from the beginning?" His voice didn't accuse. It pleaded. "Yes," she said, "but I didn't expect to want to stay." Silence swelled. He set the cup down without drinking. "So you were paid to come here, to help the strange boy in the tower feel a little less broken." Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "No," she said. "I was invited to meet you. What happened after was mine. But it started with them," he said, rising now, pacing. "With a signature and a salary." Ava stood too, closing the space between them. "I can't change how I entered your life, but I chose to stay in it, every day since." He turned to her, his expression torn. Do you know what it feels like to believe just for once that someone saw you without being sent? She stepped closer. I saw you, Elijah, before I even met you. I read your words, your drawings, your silences. I recognized you. But you didn't tell me. Ava took a trembling breath. Because I was afraid the truth would ruin everything we'd begun to build. And now he asked, voice low. Now she said, placing her hand over her heart, I'm standing in the storm with you, if you'll let me. He looked at her for a long time, then turned and walked away, not with anger, but with heartbreak. And Ava, standing alone in the soft light of the kitchen, realized that even the most beautiful structures will crumble if the foundation was built on anything less than truth. The following days passed in a hush too deep to name. Gone was the easy rhythm they had built those quiet afternoons in the observatory, the walks beneath whispering olive trees, the shared silence at dusk. What remained was space vast and aching, the kind of silence that doesn't just linger but accuses. Elijah did not vanish, not physically. He still moved through the estate like a ghost in his own home, but Ava could feel it, the veil. He no longer looked her in the eye, no longer hovered near her presence like a moth inching toward warmth. He had retreated behind a door no one had closed but her. And she couldn't blame him. The worst part of a fracture isn't the pain. It's the knowledge that it might have been avoidable if only you'd spoken sooner, held tighter, believed better in each other's capacity to understand. Ava didn't sleep much. She spent her nights in the library reading pages she could no longer absorb, or wandering the hallways like the woman in a painting, quiet, poised, slowly unraveling behind the frame. Alfred watched with gentle worry but said nothing. Meredith remained silent, almost respectfully, so as if the damage had been done, and she would not press her hand upon the bruise. On the fourth night, the rain returned. Not the soft mist of earlier days, but a full downpour, wild and honest. Thunder cracked in the distance, and the windows of the old estate trembled with each gust. It was in that storm that Ava decided no more silences. She found him where she had guessed he might be, curled in the chair beneath the telescope, the observatory dark but for a single lamp, and the blue glow of his screen casting constellations across his pale face. He didn't turn when she entered. She walked slowly toward him, her feet bare against the stone hair damp from the rain. Elijah. His fingers stilled. I don't expect you to forgive me, she began, voice low, breath catching. But I need you to know the truth. Not the omission, not the softened version, just the truth. At first he didn't respond. Then he said, it's late. I know, but I can't sleep while you're hurting. He exhaled, that sound that wasn't quite a sigh but a surrender. I was recruited, she said, by a private firm that works with families like yours, wealthy, private, desperate for connection, but afraid of it at the same time. Your parents didn't give me details, only that you were struggling, that you needed someone trained to understand without intruding. She took another step forward. I said no. At first, it felt invasive, manipulative. But then, they gave me a file, not medical, not psychiatric, just your art, your words, the book you wrote about the Ring Nebula, a video clip of you speaking at 16, so hesitant, so brilliant. And I realized I didn't feel pity. I felt recognition. Elijah finally looked up. His eyes held no fury, only ache, like the dull pain left after a wound has stopped bleeding. I came, Ava continued, because I saw someone beautiful beneath the quiet, someone worth knowing even if you never let me in. I didn't come to fix you. I came to meet you. And yet he said, voice hoarse, you didn't tell me the truth. I was afraid that if I did, you'd never believe anything real that came after. He stood suddenly, his movements sharp but not violent, just filled with too much feeling and nowhere to place it. You were the first person who made me feel normal, he said. Not like a project, not like an heir to be salvaged. Just me. I never saw you as a project. But you were sent, Ava. That matters. She crossed the room to him now, slowly, heart-thudding. Yes, she said, I was sent, but I stayed because of you. Because you, Elijah Sterling, are the first man who made me feel seen without needing to perform. Do you have any idea how rare that is? For a black woman to be seen, not for what she carries or survives, but for who she is. He blinked. The storm crashed beyond the glass above them. I felt safe, she whispered, for the first time in years. And I know I broke something by not telling you the truth sooner. But please, don't mistake a misstep for a betrayal. He looked at her, looked through her, and then quietly, do you still want to stay? The question was a blade wrapped in hope. She stepped closer, more than anything. He nodded once, then slowly reached out and placed her hand over his chest. His heart pounded beneath her fingers. I want to trust you, he said, eyes glistening, even if I don't know how. Ava leaned in, forehead touching his. Then let's relearn it together. They stood like that as the thunder rolled, the wind howled, and the stars blinked unseen above the clouds. And in that moment, heart to heart, soul to soul, they chose each other. Not despite the truth, but because of it. Dawn did not so much rise over the vineyard as bloom. It began as a faint blush behind the hills, like the first warmth of a long-awaited letter spreading slow and sure over the estate. The storm had passed, leaving the earth rinsed clean, as if every blade of grass, every dew-touched vine had been forgiven. Inside the observatory, silence lingered, not the strained silence of the days before, but the hush that follows an honest confession. Elijah and Ava had fallen asleep there, wrapped in a stillness so tender it needed no words to protect it. He sat in the armchair, head tilted slightly against the cushion, and she lay curled nearby, her body softened by sleep, one hand resting on the edge of his. When the light reached their faces, Elijah stirred first. His eyes blinked open slowly, unsure whether the peace he felt belonged to the dream or the waking. But when he turned and saw her there, real, breathing still, his body did not flinch. It simply exhaled. He studied her for a long moment. Her hair had tumbled free in the night, cascading across her shoulder in waves of dark silk. There was a crease on her cheek from where she had leaned into the armrest, and her lips were slightly parted, as if even in sleep she was listening. Not just dreaming, listening. He didn't move to wake her. Not yet. Because for the first time in his life, Elijah realized something strange. He was not afraid of the morning. Not when she was in it. Ava woke not long after to the scent of rosemary and something warm and unfamiliar. She found herself wrapped in a soft blanket, and the chair opposite hers empty, but still indented with his presence. Then came the sound of footsteps, and his voice. I didn't want to wake you, Elijah said, stepping into the room holding a tray. But you slept through the sunrise, which, by the way, was spectacular. Ava sat up, blinking the sleep from her eyes. You brought breakfast. He set the tray down with a shy sort of pride. Toast with local honey tea with too much milk, because you always say just a splash, and then add more, and a soft-boiled egg I may have overcooked. She laughed softly, touched the edge of the tray. This is the most human thing you've ever done. He looked almost embarrassed. I Googled it. Even better. They ate together on the floor, leaning against the wall, legs stretched out before them like children at a picnic. Between bites, they spoke not in deep, heavy confessions, but light talk, teasing, curious, hopeful. It was their first real morning, and something had shifted. Not in loud declarations or sweeping passion, but in ease. In the way Elijah no longer flinched when their shoulders brushed. In how Ava didn't feel the need to narrate every thought for fear he might misread her silence. I want to show you something, he said after breakfast, rising and offering her his hand. They walked down from the observatory and out into the morning light, still soft with the hush of dawn. He led her through the vineyard, past the rose garden, and down a narrow path she hadn't noticed before, half hidden beneath wisteria and ivy. At the end of it stood a greenhouse, old but lovingly maintained. The panes fogged slightly inside, alive with green. He opened the door. Ava stepped in and gasped. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and life, cascading vines, tiny citrus trees, orchids arranged like secrets. In one corner, a small desk sat covered in watercolor sketches, pressed leaves, and a notebook cracked open in the middle of a sentence. This was my mother's, he said quietly. She used to spend hours here, before the world got too loud. Ava turned to him. And now, he shrugged, now it's mine, or maybe still hers. I come here when I forget how to breathe. She stepped to the desk, ran a finger over the sketches. You paint? Only in private. I'm glad you brought me here. He watched her as she wandered, touching the leaves, gently pausing to smell the lemon blossoms. She moved through the space like someone reading a story already known by heart. And then in the middle of the greenhouse, she turned. Elijah. He stopped. There's something growing between us, she said softly. Something delicate, but I think it wants to live. He nodded, words thick in his throat. I feel it too. She stepped forward. Then let's not be afraid of what it becomes. Their hands met again, no longer with caution, but with intent. He cupped her face slowly, as if still learning the shape of daring, and she leaned in not to take, but to meet. When their lips touched, it was not a surge, not a crash. It was the awakening of something already begun. A kiss born not from hunger, but reverence. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask a question, it answers one. And outside, as if in blessing, the wisteria swayed. The vineyard breathed and the light broke fully over the land. They stood in the greenhouse, two people who had crossed oceans of solitude, now rooted in the same soil. Awake. Together. There are moments when the world, for all its chaos and noise, folds inward and becomes a sanctuary. For Elijah and Ava, the days that followed the greenhouse kiss felt like living inside that sanctuary. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. There was a new honesty in their rhythms, a gentleness that replaced fear, a rhythm that found its own tempo without force or design. They no longer tiptoed around their proximity. Her fingers would brush his sleeve and linger. He would pass her a book and allow their hands to meet longer than necessary. And at night they would sit on the terrace with a blanket over their laps, watching the sky without the ache of distance between them. It was in many ways the beginning of something neither of them had ever been taught to believe was possible. A love not built on illusion but revelation. On a particularly warm Sunday, Ava took Elijah by surprise. You've seen so much of my world, she said, balancing a basket of fresh bread and apples on her hip. Come see mine. Elijah blinked his tea, forgotten mid-sip. Your world. My neighborhood. My people. My music, my food, the way I move through space when I'm not dressed like a private school tutor or treading quietly through wine country. He hesitated, not from fear but from reverence. I'd like that, he said. They took his car, a sleek, charcoal-colored coupe he barely knew how to drive. Ava directed him down roads he'd never thought to explore, past the polished gates of the estate, beyond the rows of vines and manicured driveways. The streets became narrower, louder. Children raced along sidewalks in mismatched sneakers. Shopkeepers shouted greetings from open doors. Murals of jazz legends and poets adorned brick walls like stained glass in a church made of rhythm. Ava came alive. She waved to neighbors, introduced Elijah to a baker who hugged her too tightly, a saxophonist who kissed her hand, and a woman named Yaya who sold healing teas and cursed the humidity. Elijah, silent but wide-eyed, watched Ava in awe. The way she moved through the space like sunlight sliding over familiar furniture. Here she didn't shrink herself, didn't soften her edges. She laughed louder, stood taller, and spoke with a cadence that pulsed like a drum beat. They ended up at a block party that hadn't been planned but was happening anyway. Grills smoked on corners, someone played Marvin Gaye from a window above, and a child handed Elijah a melting popsicle as if it were a sacred rite. You okay? Ava asked, nudging him gently. I've never been better, he replied, and meant it. Later, they sat on the stoop of her aunt's house, watching the evening unravel in waves of laughter and lawn chairs. Ava turned to him, her expression soft. You see me here, as I am, not just the quiet woman who listens well. I see you, he said, and I love all of it. Her breath caught. You do? Elijah smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep within. I do, and not in some abstract, you healed me kind of way. I love you because you challenged me, because you saw the boy in the tower and didn't try to tear the walls down. You just knocked gently until I opened the door. Tears welled in Ava's eyes, unbidden, but not unwelcome. Elijah, she said, voice shaking, no one's ever told me that without asking for something in return. He reached out, brushing his thumb along her cheekbone. Then let me be the first who doesn't. Their kiss this time was different. Not new, not uncertain. It was an unveiling. Not of bodies, but of truths, of scars and strength, and the kind of devotion that asks to be chosen again and again, even on the days when it's hard. As dusk fell and the first stars blinked awake, Ava rested her head on Elijah's shoulder. He leaned into her, not to be held but to hold. There on a worn stoop in the heart of her world, they found something that neither wealth nor silence could ever build. They found a love unhidden, a love unveiled. Love when new can feel like a glass orb suspended in sunlight, glowing weightless as if it might float forever. But glass is still glass, and eventually something always touches it. The first crack didn't come with a scream, it came with a phone call. Ava was in the garden barefoot among the lavender and sage, a basket at her hip, soft humming on her lips. Elijah stood a few feet away, watering the hydrangeas one hand, shielding his eyes against the late morning sun. His phone buzzed on the stone bench, once, twice. He glanced at it, intending to ignore it. But the third buzz flashed a name across the screen that made his pulse falter. Jonathan Sterling, father. He hadn't spoken to the man in months. Elijah dried his hands, picked up the phone, and walked toward the shade. "Hello? Son." The voice was cool, precise, as if cut from marble. "I hear you found someone." Elijah stiffened. "Is this why you're calling?" "Don't play the victim," Jonathan said. "You know why I'm calling. Meredith tells me you've gotten attached." There was a pause. "Tell me, Elijah, does she know who paid her first month's salary?" Elijah's breath stilled. "She knows everything," he said, unsure if it was truth or wish. "Does she?" Jonathan murmured. "Because I don't think even you know everything. What are you implying?" But Jonathan didn't answer directly. He never did. Instead, he said the one thing Elijah feared most. "You've built yourself a fantasy, son. But fantasies don't survive storms, especially not when the foundation is rot." Then he hung up. That afternoon, Elijah was quieter than usual. Ava noticed, of course. She noticed everything. The way he stirred his tea clockwise 3 times instead of 4. The way he pressed the bridge of his nose like he did when his mind spun too fast to rest. The way his smiles came slower, like sun filtered through rain. "Elijah," she said, gently brushing her fingers against his sleeve. "You're somewhere else." He looked at her eyes, soft but distant. "I got a call. From my father." Ava froze. "He knows," he said. "About you, about us." "I assumed he would eventually." Elijah studied her. "He said there are things I still don't know." The pause between them widened like a rift. Ava stood slowly. Her voice was steady, but her hands had begun to tremble. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know," Elijah admitted. "But I know how he operates. He doesn't lie outright. He doesn't need to. He poisons with doubt." Ava took a step back, breath uneven. "You're wondering if I'm still keeping things from you." "I'm wondering," he said carefully, "how much of us began with his fingerprints on the thread." Silence. Then Ava whispered, "So am I." That night the storm returned. Not outside, the skies remained painfully clear, but within. Ava lay awake staring at the dark ceiling, her heart pulsing like a question she couldn't answer. In the hallway she heard Elijah pacing, stopping, starting again, like his thoughts had become a maze he couldn't exit. She rose barefoot again and padded into the corridor. He turned as she approached, eyes, heavy shirt rumpled. "Elijah," she said, voice a hush, "don't run from me." "I'm not running," he said. "I'm trying to stay." "Then stay, with me, here, in this moment." He shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't know what's real anymore." She moved to him, took his face in her hands. "This is real," she whispered. "The way I breathe differently when you look at me. The way you say my name like it was made of music. The way we fit." "But what if it was all arranged?" he asked, barely audible. "What if the only reason we found each other was because someone engineered it?" She swallowed. "Does it matter how the story started if we chose the middle ourselves?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward and placed his forehead against hers. They stayed like that for a long time. Two people with their love exposed to wind, trying to hold it together with bare hands. The next morning, Elijah disappeared. Not entirely, not in the old way. He left a note, his handwriting tight and small. "I need space to think. I need to separate your voice from his. Please don't look for me. I will come back when I know which thoughts are mine." Ava stared at the words, then folded the paper once, then again, pressing it against her chest. She did not cry, not yet. Instead, she walked into the greenhouse and sat among the lemon blossoms, letting the sunlight fall across her face. She waited, and in that quiet ache she realized the storm had not destroyed the orb, but it had fractured it, and only time would tell if it could still hold light. The house felt too large without him. Elijah's absence did not howl through its hallways like a scream. It lingered, like a perfume left behind on a wool sweater, intimate and suffocating in the same breath. Ava moved through the estate like a woman haunted, but not by ghosts, by memories, too vivid, too recent. The soft indentation on the couch where he used to sit cross-legged. The half-read astronomy journal still left on the armrest. A coffee mug in the sink, its dried ring a timestamp of yesterday's warmth. And in the observatory, his scent, cedar, and old paper still clung to the air. But his presence, that was gone. He hadn't called, hadn't written. It had been 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of watching her phone, checking the driveway for headlights, walking to the mailbox, as if something, anything might come to anchor her back to him. But nothing did. Only the wind returned. On the fourth morning, Ava stood at the edge of the vineyard, staring at the fog curled between the vines. Her coat was wrapped tightly around her, but it couldn't hold back the cold that had settled somewhere deeper beneath the ribs, behind the spine. The kind of chill that isn't cured by heat but by answers. But no answers had come, only questions. Was it love or a performance of love? Had she earned his trust or borrowed it from a fantasy he needed to believe in? Had she told him the truth too late, or had she never really told it at all? Self-doubt was a cruel architect. It didn't demolish, it redesigned. Every memory she had once cherished was now reframed under a crueler light. That night in the greenhouse, had he kissed her or the idea of her? That first morning they shared tea, did he smile because of her or because he needed someone to fill the silence? That moment under the telescope, did he touch her hand or just reach for the first thing steady enough not to vanish? And if she were to leave now, quietly, would he even come back to find her? She didn't know. And that was the sharpest ache of all. Meredith found her in the kitchen that evening, staring at the kettle, though it had long since stopped whistling. "I'm sorry," Meredith said softly. Ava blinked, not turning. For what? For being right in all the wrong ways. Ava's lips curled weary. "You warned me. I warned you about the walls he builds," Meredith said. "But I never imagined you'd try to live inside them with him." That made Ava turn. "I wasn't trying to fix him." "I know," Meredith said. "That's why it almost worked." A beat of silence passed. "Do you think he'll come back?" Ava asked, her voice so quiet it barely passed the space between them. Meredith looked at her, then not as an assistant or a guardian, but as a woman who had watched love fail more times than it survived. "I think," Meredith said, "he's trying to figure out if he can believe in something that didn't begin with his own permission. And if he decides he can't," Meredith paused, then answered gently, "then at least he'll know you never lied to him about the one thing that matters." "What's that?" "That you loved him even when it hurt." Ava slept restlessly that night, if sleep was what one could call it. Her dreams were a collage of almosts, of moments that shimmered but never resolved. A door half opened, a hand that never quite reached hers. At dawn she rose and walked barefoot into the vineyard, the soil cold and soft beneath her soles. She knelt beside the vines not to tend them, but to be with them, to anchor herself. This land had taught her so much about patience, about growth, about silence that feeds rather than starves. She had come here expecting to help someone else heal. She had not expected to break open. But maybe that too was a kind of grace. To be dismantled by love meant the structure had existed to begin with, and the foundation, though cracked, was still hers. Far away, Elijah sat in a small cabin tucked into a ridge above the Mendocino coast. He had chosen the place not for its comfort, it had little of that, but for its quiet. There was no cell signal, no email, no curated playlists or home automation. Only a notebook, a cot, and the sound of waves crashing against rocks below. He had thought the silence would soothe him. Instead, it echoed her voice. In the first day, he had tried to distract himself with logic, sketching nebulae from memory, calculating trajectories, writing algorithms no one had asked for. By the second day, he stopped drawing altogether. The stars had lost their clarity. And now on the sixth night, he sat by the window, staring out at the obsidian sea, her name echoing in the surf. He had left to find clarity. What he found was longing, not just for her touch, but for her truth. The way she had stood firm when he shook. The way she had chosen him, not because he was broken, but because he was becoming. And he had left her. in his fear, in his doubt, in the very same cycle he had sworn to break. Elijah placed his hand against the cold window pane and whispered the words into the dark. I miss you, Ava. And for the first time since he left, he wasn't afraid of what she might say in return. The invitation came in the form of an envelope with a gold crest pressed into thick cream-colored paper. Ava turned it over twice before opening it, sensing that whatever lay inside would not simply ask for her presence, it would test her resolve. Inside, elegant script announced the Sterling Foundation Autumn Benefit Gala to be held at the family's flagship hotel in San Francisco. The list of hosts included names both familiar and sharpened with legacy Jonathan and Evelyn Sterling alongside their son Elijah. Her breath caught. He was back. Not back home, not back to her, but back into the world, the one where spotlights hurt more than they healed. And the people who clapped for you were often the first to carve at your softness the moment you stumbled. She read the final line again. Guests are encouraged to bring partners or companions. A dagger disguised as civility. Meredith found her on the veranda, later invitation laid like a wound across the table. So Meredith said softly, what will you wear? Ava turned startled. You think I'm going? I think Meredith replied, you've never run from anything before. Why start now? The night of the gala arrived swathed in velvet fog. San Francisco shimmered beneath a halo of golden light, the kind that makes every building look like it's holding its breath. The Sterling Hotel glowed like a cathedral, its steps flanked by floral arrangements so lush they looked like they belonged in a royal wedding. Ava stepped out of the car in a deep emerald gown that clung to her like language fluid, precise, unforgettable. Her curls were pulled back in soft waves, and her gaze held the same quiet fire she wore the first day she stepped into Elijah's world, except this time she owned it. Inside the ballroom, 1,000 tiny lights sparkled above like artificial constellations. A string quartet played something mournful. Laughter clinked in champagne glasses, polite and practiced. And there near the center of the room stood Elijah. He was dressed in classic black, but there was nothing simple about him. He looked like a man newly formed, still himself, but tempered by fire. Not the boy who had once flinched at every glance, but not yet the man who would never flinch again. Their eyes met. It took less than a breath for the room to vanish. She didn't move. Neither did he. But people began to notice. Whispers slithered around them like silk scarves. Isn't that the girl who didn't the parents hire? I heard she was a social worker. No, maybe a therapist or what do you call it? Emotional escort. A woman in a blue gown laughed too loudly. Jonathan Sterling cleared his throat from the podium, his voice smooth as polished bone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. This year, the Sterling Foundation will be focusing its philanthropic efforts on mental health research and neurological support fields quite dear to my son's heart. A ripple of applause. Elijah stepped forward. Ava saw it in his shoulders, tension restraint, but he met his father's gaze without wavering, then turned to the crowd. I'd like to say a few words. Jonathan hesitated ever so slightly but stepped aside. Elijah took the microphone. I used to think that silence was protection, that if I didn't speak, I couldn't be hurt, that if I didn't let people in, I couldn't be betrayed. He paused, scanning the room. But what I learned this year is that silence can also be a cage, a beautiful padded cell where nothing ever grows. A hush fell over the audience. Elijah's voice steadied. I met someone who challenged that, who didn't break down my walls but offered me her hand and waited while I opened the door. Someone who saw not just what I feared, but what I could become. People began turning to look at Ava now. She stood still, chin lifted. My family, Elijah said, glancing toward Jonathan without flinching, believed I needed to be managed, that I could be brought back to the world if someone played the right role. He looked directly at Ava. But what I needed wasn't performance. It was presence. It was truth. Even when it was hard, even when it hurt, Ava's breath trembled. I don't know what the Sterling legacy will look like in 20 years, Elijah continued. But I know this: it will no longer be built on silence, secrecy, or shame. It will be built on the kind of love that sees, accepts, and transforms. Another pause. He turned fully toward Ava now. And if the person who taught me that can forgive me, then I'll consider myself the luckiest man in this room. Gasps. Not from scandal, from recognition. The reckoning was not loud. It was clear. Later after the gala, after the applause and the questions and the polite chaos that always followed a truth spoken plainly, Elijah found her standing alone on the balcony. The fog had returned, wrapping the skyline in silver lace. He stepped beside her, silent. "I didn't come here to forgive you," she said without turning. He nodded. "I know. I came because I had to see if the man who walked away from me could ever come back as someone new." He looked at her. And did he? She finally turned. "I don't know yet," she said, but he spoke like someone who's trying. He reached out, tentative but without fear. "I am," he whispered, "every hour." Her fingers brushed his. Not a promise, but not a refusal. In a world that often demands resolution, this was something braver, a beginning rewritten. Under a sky full of artificial stars and one fragile truth, finally set free. There are moments that rewrite everything. Not with noise, but with stillness. Not with grandeur, but with grace. It was the kind of morning that arrived quietly, sunlight spilled like melted gold over the vineyard hills, the fog having lifted overnight as if in gentle surrender. In the kitchen, the kettle began to hum, and the scent of rosemary bread drifted through open windows. Spring had come not with fireworks, but with a promise. Ava stood on the veranda, her robe fluttering at her ankles, a cup of jasmine tea warming her palms. She looked out at the rows of vines that had once been foreign and silent, but now they felt like a chorus, like roots and green things that had chosen to stay. Behind her, Elijah emerged barefoot and rumpled sleep still curling at the edge of his eyes. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he pressed a kiss to her temple and stood beside her. "They're waking," she whispered, meaning the vines. He smiled. "So are we." It had been 3 weeks since the gala. 3 weeks since words, true words, had been spoken aloud, no longer buried in fear or softened for palatability. Since then, life had not resumed as if nothing had happened. No, it had evolved. Elijah hadn't returned to the tower he once called home. Instead, he moved into the guest cottage on Ava's side of the vineyard, a space he filled with books and stargazing charts with wildflowers from her garden and photographs from the markets they now strolled together each Sunday. There was no dramatic sweep of declarations, no insistent fireworks. What grew between them now was slow, deliberate, like sourdough, rising overnight, or trust threading itself stitch by stitch back into the torn places. And Elijah, in his quiet way, had begun writing again. Not code, not algorithms, but stories. Tiny fictions he folded into scraps of paper and left on her pillow. Each one a window into his mind, and more vulnerably, his heart. Ava read them all. Some made her laugh, some made her cry, but each reminded her love was not built in a single kiss. It was layered. 1,000 tiny choices made daily to stay, to see, to try. The day he proposed, it rained in the morning. Not a storm, but a soft, steady drizzle like the sky itself had grown tender. Ava had just returned from town, cheeks kissed pink by the cold hair, damp beneath her scarf. She stepped into the cottage expecting music, maybe tea and the quiet rhythm they had settled into. Instead, she found a trail of paper stars, dozens of them, each one folded from the pages of his notebook dusted with gold ink. She bent down and picked up the first. "You said love isn't about fixing. You were right." Another a few feet farther. "But I do think love heals what was never broken, just scared." And another, if every scar is a chapter, then you've read all of mine." Out loud, without shame. She followed the trail through the cottage and out the back door, where the rain had stopped, leaving the sky washed and waiting. Elijah stood in the greenhouse. The door was open. The space had changed since that night, the night of their first real kiss. The night he had first touched her and not recoiled but leaned in. Now it was strung with soft lanterns and wrapped in honeysuckle vines. In the center, a telescope aimed skyward and a small wooden box resting on the table beside it. He turned as she entered. "I wanted to show you the stars," he said, voice hushed. "But then I realized I already had." He stepped forward, took her hands in his. "Ava Simone Carter," he said, eyes steady, "when you walked into my world, I thought you were there to teach me how to live in it. But you didn't teach me how to live." He paused. "You taught me how to love." Tears began to gather at the corners of her eyes as if summoned by memory, by truth. "I'm not perfect. I still struggle. I still doubt, but I have never been more certain of anything than I am of this. He opened the box. Inside a simple ring, a band of rose gold wrapped around a small, rough-cut diamond, imperfect, unpolished, beautiful. Will you marry me? Silence. The kind that holds breath. The kind that waits not for an answer, but for a becoming. Ava didn't speak. Not at first. Instead, she stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his. She let the silence stretch between them, not heavy but holy. And then in a whisper that was more vow than reply, she said, yes. Later, after they had laughed and cried and held each other like gravity had loosened its grip, they stood beside the telescope. Elijah adjusted it gently, motioning for her to look. She leaned forward and through the lens saw the rings of Saturn, clear and glowing, delicate as lace. Do you know, he murmured, those rings are made of shattered moons? She turned to him surprised. Millions of years ago, something broke, and instead of disappearing, it became beautiful. He looked at her then fully. So did we. She smiled. And for the first time in either of their lives, the stars did not feel distant. They felt like witnesses. It began with a whisper in the body, something small and sacred, like the earliest notes of a lullaby waiting to be sung. Ava noticed it first in the quiet moments, the way her energy faded a little earlier each day, the strange, tender ache behind her ribs, the inexplicable calm that settled over her like soft linen at dusk. She didn't tell Elijah right away, not out of fear, but out of reverence, as if saying it aloud too soon might startle the miracle into silence. Instead, she waited, watched, listened, and when the truth could no longer be folded into mystery, she took his hand one morning in the garden and placed it gently over her stomach. He blinked, confused. Are you cold? No, she whispered. I'm carrying us. The silence that followed was unlike any they had known before. Not hesitant, not stunned, but awed. Elijah's eyes welled with something that looked like belief, finally anchored to something real. A baby, he said, the word soft as breath. Ava nodded, eyes luminous. Elijah knelt before her, both hands now cradling the space that held their beginning. You are my whole world, he whispered to her belly, and now you're too. The vineyard shifted with the seasons golden and full beneath autumn skies. And so did they. Elijah, once a man of retreat and silence, began talking to the baby each morning. He would kneel beside Ava as she sipped her tea, murmuring astrophysics facts in a hush like bedtime stories. Sometimes he played Chopin. Other times he sang off-key lullabies he remembered from his own childhood, long buried but oddly intact. Ava grew radiant, not in the cliché way, but in a quietly powerful one. Like the earth itself, making room, deepening roots. Their evenings were full of soft preparations, folding tiny clothes, debating over names, laughing about which of them the baby might resemble, though they both knew neither feature nor skin would define this child more than the love already encircling them. But love, Ava knew, had shadows too. One of them came knocking one afternoon wrapped in gray wool and regret. Jonathan Sterling. She opened the door without flinching. Hello, Ava, he said, gaze flickering to the soft curve beneath her sweater. You're not here to bless the baby, are you? She asked evenly. I'm here because I owe my son and you an apology. Ava raised an eyebrow. You think that's enough? No, Jonathan admitted, but it's a start. And maybe one day when he's a father, he'll understand how hard it is to see your child become something you never prepared for. He didn't need preparation, Ava said. He needed permission, and you never gave it. Jonathan swallowed hard. She stepped aside. Elijah is in the observatory. Will he see me? I don't know, she said honestly. But if you've come to unmake what we've built, turn around now. Jonathan met her eyes. For once, he didn't try to win the stare. He just nodded, stepped past her, and disappeared into the corridor of glass and stars. Ava found Elijah hours later sitting beneath the walnut tree in the back field. His face was unreadable, but his hands were curled protectively around a folded sonogram print. She didn't ask what had been said. He didn't offer, but he reached for her hand and laid it over his heart. He's not the man I wanted him to be, Elijah said, but maybe I'm no longer the man he tried to make me. You never were, she whispered. He turned to her then and smiled with something deeper than peace. I want our child to grow up in truth, not perfection, not silence, just honesty. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. That's all I've ever wanted too. The promise came not in vows or ceremony, but in the night of the first real kick. They were lying in bed, the room lit only by the amber glow of a salt lamp. Ava's breathing was slow, almost meditative. Elijah had one hand splayed over her stomach, the other wrapped gently around her fingers. And then sudden and sure a flutter, a tiny nudge. A life saying hello. Elijah sat up straight, eyes wide. Was that? She nodded, grinning through a tear. Our child just danced. He looked at her with reverence as if she were both cathedral and sanctuary. I didn't know, he whispered. That love could keep expanding like this. It always does, she said, guiding his hand back to her belly. When it's real? Then, quiet for a moment, Ava reached into the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. I've been writing, she said, letters to the baby. Elijah took it, thumbing gently through the first few pages, her handwriting curved and neat, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. Dear little light, you are not born yet, but already you are known. Already you are loved. We will not promise to be perfect, but we will promise to try, to show up, to speak truth, to grow beside you and never in front of you. We will give you stars and dirt and story, and we will let you decide which ones feel most like home. He pressed the journal to his chest, overcome. May I add to it? Ava smiled. I was hoping you would. He leaned down and whispered to her stomach, we'll learn together, little one. Then to Ava, he said, let's write the kind of life no one expected, quiet but bright, strong but soft. She nodded, and in that room of stillness and soft breath and the quiet thrum of new life, the promise was made not in rings or ceremonies, but in the way two people looked at each other and silently vowed. This love will last longer than our fear. This family will be built not on what we were taught, but on what we choose. And this child will never need to earn the love already waiting for them. The night sky above Sonoma was stitched with stars more than usual. It seemed as if the heavens themselves had gathered to witness the quiet miracle unfolding below. Ava stood barefoot in the dewy grass behind their farmhouse, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other clutching a mug of ginger tea. The baby had been moving all day, as if dancing to some invisible music, and now settled into stillness, lulled by the cool air and the rhythm of her heartbeat. Elijah emerged from the house with a blanket draped over one arm and a telescope tucked under the other. He walked slowly, reverently, as if not to disturb the fragile beauty of this moment. He smiled at her, the way only a man in love can, soft, warm, certain. Clear skies tonight, he said, setting the telescope in place. You'll be able to see all the way to Orion. Ava raised an eyebrow playfully. Is that a promise, Mr. Sterling? It's a forecast, he murmured, kissing her forehead. But for you, I'll make it a vow. They spread the blanket across the ground and lay side by side, staring up at the great velvet expanse above them. Elijah traced the constellations with his finger. There's Cassiopeia, and there, look closely, that's Lyra. Ava squinted. They don't look like much. He laughed. They never do until you connect the dots. She turned to him, kind of like us. He nodded, suddenly solemn. I used to think the stars were the only constant in my life, but they were just the map. You're the destination. Ava reached for his hand and laced her fingers through his. We both wandered, she whispered, but we wandered toward each other. The wind rustled the grapevines behind them like a lullaby in the language of leaves. Elijah's voice grew soft. Do you remember what I said to you that first night in the observatory? You were trying not to run away, she teased. He chuckled. True, but I said I didn't know how to be touched without unraveling. Ava looked into his eyes, and now? He brushed his thumb against her knuckles. Now I unravel willingly, every time you look at me like this. They lay in silence again, letting the starlight fall over them like a blessing. Then slowly Elijah sat up and turned to her, his expression more serious than she'd seen in weeks. I want to do something, he said, pulling out a small wooden box from his coat pocket. Ava tilted her head. We're already engaged, remember? This isn't for you, he said gently. Well, not just for you. He opened the box to reveal a silver chain, delicate and luminous. Hanging from it was a charm, a constellation, 5 tiny stars in the shape of a crooked W. Cassiopeia, he said, the queen who waited even when it meant hanging in the sky alone, a symbol for our daughter. Ava gasped softly. Elijah placed the necklace into her hands. You've given her life. You've given me life. This is just a small piece of that legacy. Tears shimmered in her eyes. She'll wear it when she's ready. She'll be ready, he said, because she'll be raised by truth and kindness and stubborn, relentless love. They leaned into each other, foreheads, pressed hearts beating in rhythm beneath a sky that had witnessed too much sorrow and now finally was witnessing peace. Ava whispered, "We are a constellation now, you, me, and her." No, Elijah corrected gently. Us, all of us. Every scar, every breath, every moment that brought us here. And together they lay beneath the stars, no longer drifting, not searching, not surviving, but belonging. Some stories begin with fireworks, others begin in silence. Ours began with fear, but it ends with light. If this story touched you, if you saw even a flicker of your own hope, pain, or love in the journey of Elijah and Ava, don't let it fade with the last word. Like this video, if you believe in second chances, share your favorite moment in the comments. We'd love to know which part of their journey made your heart stir. And subscribe to our channel for more love stories that speak to the soul, where healing is possible and love is always worth the wait. Because the stars are still shining, and somewhere someone is writing their own constellation.